you're under threat, like say a tiger in the jungle, there's often an instant sort of startle response where the whole body sort of freezes for a moment to look at what to do, and then often there's this fight, flight, surge of adrenaline. But if you really can't fight, if the predator's bigger than you and faster than you and you can't get away, this freeze response kicks in where people become immobilized, and that's helpful sometimes for people who've gone through trauma. If they've frozen thinking what happened, well actually it's your body's way of trying to keep you safe.
You're listening to the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast, the show that blends science and heart to bring you evidence-based tips and tricks for cultivating a healthy, wealthy, and meaningful life. Now, here's your host, therapist, yogi, and fellow full life balancer, Dr. Caitlin Harkis.
Hi there, welcome to Wisdom for Wellbeing. Today I am delighted to introduce you to Dr. Gregory Smith. Today we are talking all things around breathing, pranayama, whatever language you would like to use, as Greg has recently published the book Purposeful Breathing. I am really blessed that Greg is actually based here in Adelaide, South Australia. So I'm able to work with him as a colleague, to be able to catch up for coffees and talk all things mind-body connection and psychology fairly regularly. But to give you a little bit of a background so that you can get the sense of where Greg is coming from himself, he is a psychologist who has worked for more than 30 years in brief, empowering ways to help people experiencing difficulties with anxiety, depression, trauma, and all kinds of life crises. And the more time has gone on, the more he has refined some simple skills for helping with a range of difficulties, and very central to this has been the use of conscious breathing. Greg has also worked as a lecturer in counseling and psychotherapy and has taught these skills over several years to graduate students. Now, the other path to these ideas comes from a lifelong love of yoga. A central part of yoga is pranayama, the art and science of breathing and life energy. So perhaps not surprisingly, Greg is a qualified yoga teacher, and in recent years, he has studied the exciting developments through which Western science is beginning to provide explanations for many of the things that are known experientially through yoga and other practices in the East for so long. Greg has a doctorate which explored inspiration in everyday life, and as I mentioned earlier, he's the author of the recently published book, Purposeful Breathing. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Smith now. Hi Greg, thank you so much for sitting down and having a conversation on Wisdom for Wellbeing with me today.
Yeah, thanks Caitlin, good to be here.
And it's nice because often I do these interviews over Zoom, so it is actually really delightful that we're actually sitting down in person in Adelaide, Australia right now, which is a unique experience for me.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So I guess just as listeners are kind of coming in and getting to know who you are, would you mind just giving us a bit of an overview of the wonderful work that you're doing and kind of what's inspired you on this path towards purposeful breathing?
So I'm a psychologist, and I've been doing psychology for many years now, and doing therapy with clients and also teaching at different times, other counsellors, and I've always had an interest in simple ways of trying to help people, and I've had a long interest in mind-body links. So as well as being a psychologist, I've trained as a yoga teacher and have taught yoga at times and pursued a lot of that, and been really interested in the interfaces between the two. And over the years, I've just found that I've often taught people who come in, particularly with anxiety, some simple breathing skills that they often get a bit surprised by, how quickly they can be effective for calming down and sort of being able to focus. And then over the years, I've been really interested in sort of expanding that link with how the breath might be used for a range of different purposes. And of course, in yoga, the breath is a very central thing as well, both in matching the breath to movement and to meditation.
It's really interesting that breathing really crosses these bounds. If we were thinking of yoga and psychology as these discrete entities, it doesn't really work like that, does it? Breath has become so well supported as a tool for us when we're experiencing mental distress or ill health. But then I think yoga brings this component of breath being used for really moving towards a state of thriving and a real, pivot point in well-being.
Yeah, so I think it can work on the full spectrum for the breath. For if there are problems, that often it can really help to sort of stabilize and overcome the problems. And then yoga is more the other end of the scale of using different types of breath for, self-actualizing and, health and really enhancing health and also linked with meditation, like for really good sort of states, to move into a positive experience.
Which is something I imagine no one can have not heard about, the benefits of meditation and, knowing that breath is a component of that and an important component of these practices.
Yeah, absolutely. One concept that I really like is the idea of modes, I think, because I think often in the West we get used to thinking, and there's a big tradition of thinking of mind and body as quite separate. We have certain thoughts and, we have body, reactions and physical movement. But I like the idea of modes that when we're actually in the process of living or talking like we are today, we're always in a certain mode, and within that, different ways of feeling and thinking and relating and perceiving, are all happening at once and are interrelated. And then as part of that, I think, styles of breathing are part of that as well, the physical reactions we have and the way, the physical stuff with the breathing. And so I think thinking in terms of modes then, that we move in and out of modes, whether it's work mode or party mode or being stressed or anxious or calm, it helps it to see, well, the breath actually, isn't such a big jump from there, that's part of it all going together.
And talk me through these modes, because maybe you could describe for us a few modes and kind of what the different breathing responses might be.
Yeah, so I think, for example, if someone's very anxious, like I find almost always when people are anxious, they tend to breathe high in the chest, often a bit gaspy. Sometimes they hold the breath, like if they're really stressed. Sometimes, for some people, it can be a bit over-breathing, like a bit panicky. But it tends to have that sort of style of breathing rather than breathing low and slow and diaphragmatically, which I'll teach people. So if someone's really anxious, often they're thinking anxious thoughts, oh my God, what's going to happen? They're feeling anxious, feeling on edge. They've probably got more adrenaline and other stress chemicals in their system. They're looking for signs of danger. We're geared towards that for anything threatening. But also the breathing patterns change. And it means if you can change one of those things, then maybe the others can change too. And so lots of psychology will look at helping people change the anxious thoughts, which is good to do. But you can use the breath as well. And so I often find if people are really anxious breathing like that, and I'll ask them to take a deep breath. And people who are very anxious tend, when they take a deep breath, to still breathe very high in the chest. So it's trying to breathe more fully. But in general, anxious people don't breathe out very much, so they can't breathe much more in. And so if you, like, their diaphragm's important that as it goes under your ribs, and if you can breathe out using the diaphragm, really extending the exhale, then you can breathe in more fully. And it has a physically calming effect. So that's sort of, I suppose I've moved on to anxiety. But
that's really interesting, because I think so many of us, all of us experience anxiety. This is a human experience, I'll put my hand up. But, to greater or lesser extents, and at times that maybe, we're wondering why someone else might not be experiencing anxiety in this situation. It's interesting to think that these two people or ourselves in different situations, that our breathing pattern would actually change as a result of our experience, or that, vice versa, breathing changes might lead us to feeling more anxious in a situation, and that we could actually see the breath being higher in the chest and less of an exhale, a letting go that goes with it. So listeners, right now, maybe you can be just noticing your breath, because this is something we're doing all the time, breathing, but very rarely perhaps noticing.
Yeah, and of course, if people are feeling anxious, they're focused on whatever they're anxious about rather than the breath typically. Yeah. But being aware of the breath means you can use it. And I get anxious at times, and I'll certainly use it for myself. Slow, deep breathing and extending the exhale, squeezing in the belly a bit on the exhale to extend it. Okay. Has a calming effect.
So a little squeeze in the belly on the exhale and extending that exhale, trying to draw the breath down in our bodies. Yes. What are some other common modes of breathing that we might be familiar with?
So I think what I find is often if with anxiety, there's a lot in common. If I see people who are feeling really sad or depressed, that can vary a bit. But often you find there's a sort of like a big sigh at times, a sort of slumping, so that the chest is a bit compressed. You know, you can imagine that posture, people slumping a bit when they're feeling really down about something, and then often not breathing in as much. I mean, it's an exaggeration, of course, but I sometimes say anxious people don't breathe out and depressed people don't breathe in.
That's a great heuristic. Makes it easy to remember.
Yeah, and I think if you think of it, if you're really slumped, feeling down, often there's a big sigh, and then sometimes a pause before breathing in again, and having that pause out, often links with really flattened energy, and so. People, and you can imagine, people, old-fashioned advice, sort of, sitting up tall and shoulders back. But as you breathe in more fully, it does tend to lift people's mood a bit in doing that.
That's interesting that it actually shifts our physical posturing, and there's vast evidence that our physical posturing affects our mood. So here we've got this change in our breathing that also affects our physical posturing. So these two different bits of input that might help shift our emotional state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with all of that together, if you think of all of it's happening at once and the feelings associated with that, then they both can link together to help to sort of shift out of it, to lift a bit. So it's a nice thing.
That is a really nice thing. What about, I guess, what would be a breathing pattern that we might say, oh, this is a more effective, I guess it's going to be effective dependent on the situation, but a breathing pattern that maybe feels more energizing, or what would that look like? Yeah,
so I think what it helps for people just to be really aware, if they can, of their diaphragm. I mean, if people are listening, this sheet of muscle that sort of goes across your body under the ribs. And most people know it's there, but not everyone knows that at rest it's really curved upwards like a bowl or a parachute, so that those muscle fibers curve up, and as you breathe in, they sort of thicken and flatten, and it pushes the belly out a little bit, pushes the lower ribs out a little bit. Because a lot of people, I think, I'll often ask people to take a deep breath, and a lot of adults just sort of breathe high in the chest. It's like we think, our lungs are up the top here, and the breathing can be controlled by the diaphragm, by the muscles around the chest, or by a whole collection of muscles up around the neck and shoulders. And you can use all three, and a really full energizing breath can use a full breath, using all of that. But particularly using the diaphragm, so that when you're breathing in, the diaphragm sort of pulls down, the lower ribs go out a little bit, the belly goes out a little bit, and then breathing out, the diaphragm floats up, and you can squeeze in a bit to extend it, and including if you like to squeeze in the belly, particularly if people are anxious. But just breathing in and out using the diaphragm really makes a huge difference. It's like the diaphragm, so many people just aren't aware of it, and it's like this big gift waiting to be unwrapped. Like, the more you can be aware of your diaphragm, it really helps for feeling calm and breathing in a nice way. So two good ways are, one, just breathing where you're breathing fairly fully, mostly with the diaphragm, so that pulls down there, goes deep into the lungs, that feels like the rest of it's on its way, then breathing into the chest at the end. And then one, it can be just then letting go of the breath, the chest naturally pulls in a bit, the diaphragm floats in and up, and just doing that breath, like a relaxed exhale, is really calming and balancing, and gently energizing. And what they've found in a whole range of recent research is very interesting. If you can breathe at about 5 or 6 breaths a minute, so 5 if you're sort of big-bodied, 6 if you're smaller-bodied, but at about that rate, so you're breathing in for about 5 seconds, out for 5 seconds, or in for 6 seconds, out for 6 seconds, it brings a whole range of things in the body into balance. That we typically have these two systems, sympathetic nervous system, which is about fight or flight and being really activated, so it can be under threat or just being really activated. Then parasympathetic, it's called, which is the rest and relax sort of system. And that sort of pace of slow, deep breathing just brings them really nicely into balance. Extending the exhale prioritizes the resting system a bit more, but having an even breath, it's nice, it's balanced. It also takes a load off the heart, because it means your lungs more fully then act as an organ of circulation, as the blood, not only the oxygen, but the blood flows in and out of your lungs. That it helps, it takes pressure off your lungs, it relieves tension in the body, has a calming effect in a really positive way. It has a whole range of sort of nice flow-on effects.
That's incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting when you mention the nervous system because listeners, I think, probably have heard of, the fight or flight response and the rest and digest response. It's certainly something that's come up in podcast episodes before, but just to sort of refresh everyone's memory, it's tied back to the autonomic nervous system, which is automatic and something we often don't get a lot of control over. Like if we're sitting here and trying to slow our heartbeats down, it's a difficult journey. But here, this breath is something that rests on the border of the conscious and the unconscious, and finding, this breathing pattern you're describing, the diaphragmatic breathing, allows us by the sounds to change that whole system, to really change what's happening physiologically in our bodies. Yeah,
it's great, I think, because the autonomic system is often thought as being out of our control, and it also will control other digestion and so on. But the breathing like that, and what happens, there's the thing, I'm sure, about heart rate variability. When you breathe slowly on the inhale, typically the heart rate goes up a little bit. On the exhale, the heart rate goes down a little bit. And having that gentle sort of variation is very healthy. Sometimes when people have had trauma, they sort of get frozen in it, and it doesn't happen as much.
So their heart rate doesn't have that variability, that shifting that we might have in healthier states.
Yes, that's right. And then it puts a load on the person. And if people are really anxious and not breathing out much, as I mentioned before, or else breathing sort of quite quickly and high, it doesn't give a chance for that sort of calming effect of the sort of longer, slower exhale. Yeah. So it's sort of a nice thing to be aware of, that just slowing the exhalations down can bring your heart rate down a bit, and having that nice, even flow for about 5 or 6 breaths a minute tends to be what the research is saying as being really good. Brings everything into balance.
That's really cool. So we can actually go, okay, how frequently, what should my breathing pattern be like? And we can actually kind of go, okay, is it sort of within this 5 or 6 breaths? Where are we sitting at, as a way of monitoring how we might be going, how we might be traveling? Now, is the breath through the mouth or through the nose? How does this work?
So the mouth or nose is a really good one, and almost always it's really good to breathe through your nose. And yoga is very strong on that, apart from a couple of very small exceptions. So, and it's a really good thing to be aware of, because if you breathe through the nose, just a few things come up straight away. Your nostrils are smaller than your mouth, so it allows the flow of air to be regulated more evenly. You can sort of feel the flow of air more through your nose. It's easy if people breathe through the mouth just to sort of dump it all out very quickly, rather than slowing the breath down. And the nose, when you breathe through the nose, the nose has all these sort of, hairs covered in fine mucus and stuff. It sounds a bit gross, but it filters it and it purifies the air, and it has an antibacterial agent in it, so it helps you to stop you getting ill breathing through the nose. It probably helps even with things like COVID, I would think, but they haven't proved that it's had
there hasn't been enough research in this unusual time.
And then it also, they've found only in the last couple of decades really, it releases more nitric oxide by breathing through your nose. It generates this, and that acts to dilate blood vessels and has a whole range of other sort of effects that are very good for circulation in the body.
Okay, so you mentioned nitric oxide. So talk us through oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitric oxide, because this is an interesting interplay that I don't think all of us are aware of.
So oxygen's the first one, and most people will know that one. We need oxygen. That's the fundamental thing, the most important thing on the planet, really. I think that, a few minutes without oxygen and you're going to, shuffle off the coil. So oxygen, and breathing in breathes in oxygen, and then it gets taken up through the red blood cells, distributed through the body to the cells. And breathing out, breathe out a carbon dioxide. So the cells, when they make energy for the body, use the oxygen, and carbon dioxide's a waste product. But what people don't always know is that carbon dioxide, pretty much all the oxygen we breathe in gets taken up that way, whereas carbon dioxide in different forms, there's a lot of it in the bloodstream that fulfills a whole range of different functions, and it's more soluble in the bloodstream. So the oxygen's pretty much all taken up by the red blood cells, whereas carbon dioxide's partly taken up in the exchange, but also there's more of it in the bloodstream as carbonic acid and things like that. And The carbon dioxide, as you breathe out, it can exchange more sort of rapidly. And when people breathe like a panic attack, breathing really fast and shallow, the carbon dioxide level sort of decreases, and it changes the sort of acid-alkali balance of the body. And if you breathe really slowly, it builds up a bit, and so it can change really quite rapidly. And a lot of the desire to breathe is about carbon dioxide balance. As that builds up, as we need to have another breath.
So with the case of a panic attack, for instance, it's often described like this feeling that you can't get enough breath. So you're sort of describing people taking lots of oxygen in, taking these big breaths in, but it changes the balance so that carbon dioxide is off, and that's actually not very helpful in our system, that creates an imbalance.
And it makes it seems some research is saying it makes the nerve cells more excitable. So it almost
perpetuates, for instance, a panic state.
Yes, and so that's why things like breathing into a paper bag in the past people would do, because you're breathing in and out, and it allows you're breathing in a bit more of the carbon dioxide you breathed out, so it allows that to build up, and then that has a sort of calming effect. So over-breathing can make people a bit excitable, and that can happen sort of chronically for some people, that they're over-breathing a lot, over-breathing and then, keeping on edge.
So this is like a daily sort of breathing pattern for some of us.
Yeah, so, there's a difference between, ongoing daily breathing and then maybe using some styles of breathing, for a few minutes as an exercise. But that can happen, and it's a bit of a contested area how much, that happens and how much the body then compensates for it. But it appears that if people chronically, and some people, if they've been panic, can overbreathe, and then the body has to sort of adjust to that a bit. There was a recent Swedish study that found a whole lot of young women who were hospitalised for depression and anxiety who sort of had a chronic sort of overbreathing pattern.
That's
and it
very
linked
interesting.
with probably being sort of very much on edge. And then underbreathing, of course, if you're not breathing enough, then you need the oxygen. That's a crucial thing. But the carbon dioxide levels, build up. And that has a calming effect, but if you really underbreathe, it might make you sluggish as well, like it might go too far the other way. Okay. But it can be helpful to be aware of, because then if people are a bit panicked and over-breathing, just to hold your breath a little or take a pause between breaths can help reset some of those carbon dioxide levels quite quickly. So it's an interesting area.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting. We hear so much about needing oxygen, but actually we also need carbon dioxide.
Yes, it's about having the level of it right. Because too much of it or too little makes your blood actually more acidic or alkaline, and then that has a whole range of sort of flow-on effects.
Oh yeah, I guess that would affect your whole system, your whole biology, because we are essentially creatures who, soak up this nourishment that's passed through our blood channels and systems.
And there is some interesting research in Hungary actually that suggests that large portions of the population really chronically sort of overbreathe or underbreathe, and then the way the body compensates for that sort of links to a whole range of modern issues, from depression and anxiety conditions, but to a whole range of chronic sort of conditions in the modern world.
Okay, so like physical health as well.
Yeah, not all fully proven, but
it's an area of research by the sounds.
Yeah, it's getting more and more research, so it's very interesting.
So then coming back to the nitric oxide.
So nitric oxide is more subtle, I think. Okay. So oxygen obviously is a really, really crucial one, and carbon dioxide is much more powerful than people are aware. Nitric oxide is more subtle, but it has a role in sort of also dilating the blood vessels is one of the main things, and so being able to breathe through your nose tends to have a good sort of calming effect and helps the blood flow through the whole body, which is good.
So there's a lot. There's the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. Essentially, our autonomic nervous system is affected by breathing, and then it affects within our bodies the different levels of. I guess essentially like these chemicals. Are they considered chemicals?
They are chemicals and elements and act as sort of information transmitting in a way. The carbon dioxide, if people are over-breathing, sometimes it can link with the gut being tight and things like that. It tends to affect some of the smooth muscles in the system, both carbon dioxide and nitric oxide. So it's a good reason to breathe through your nose. And the 5 or 6 breaths per minute, people will breathe more than that when they're not conscious of it. Like average rates are faster than that. But being able to stop and just doing some slow, deep breaths is a really nice way to bring the body back into a good balance.
A good reminder to stop, to check in, and also then using these breathing exercises at times when we might be more distressed. Now, we sort of talked through the fight or flight experience. In your book, you go into polyvagal theory and also this freeze response. So would that be more like the depressed breathing? Like what is this, I guess, element of the vagus nerve, which, you know, if listeners haven't heard of, this amazing nerve, this like giant, it's the biggest nerve in our body, isn't it?
Yeah, the vagus nerve is quite extraordinary because it sort of links, it's like a frontal spine without the bone around it in a way, because it links the gut, the heart, lungs, and then a whole range of muscles around the face, voice, ears. And it's developed in an evolutionary way that it seems like very primitive creatures had this vagus nerve linked to the gut. And then over time it's sort of developed in mammals, and it's linked to a fight or flight response into a calming response, and at an extreme so it can override. So for mammals, including humans, like it links with facial contact. So if people are feeling under threat, like a warm voice tone and a smile helps to be calming, and that's important for people, working with other people, like in counseling, but you also see it like in puppies with their mums and lion cubs and all sorts, that there's that sort of interaction. And then it has this effect to be able to also calm down the heart rate, and that can be in balance, day to day with, stimulating. But then it can also link with it's a more primitive sort of form, but breathing to the belly sort of can stimulate the vagus nerve, it seems, in a calming way. But if people are under real life threat, then it's like there's a response that the body can have to take over. So if you're under threat, like see a tiger in the jungle, there's often an instant sort of startle response where the whole body sort of freezes for a moment to look at what to do, and then often there's this fight, flight, surge of adrenaline thing, and people run away or fight if they're cornered. But if you really can't fight, if the predator's bigger than you and faster than you, and you can't get away, this freeze response kicks in where people become immobilized, and they're also mapping that out more. There can be a few different sort of forms of it, but not being able to run away. And that's helpful sometimes for people who've gone through trauma. If they've frozen thinking what happened, well, actually it's your body's way of trying to keep you safe.
It's not something that people are consciously doing. It's something that I believe, the word for it that you use in your book based on Stephen Porges' work was neuroception. This idea that your body just kind of soaks up what's happening and makes a decision for you. Yeah,
and the neuroception, it's that your body will respond more quickly than you can think, and then you sort of try to figure it out afterwards. And there are parts of the brain, the amygdala in the center of the brain acts like an alarm system. So sometimes if you see something like a stick on a path and have a startle, you have that before you figure out whether it's really a stick or a snake. But also this freezing can happen where it sort of can take over if people are under, severe threat in combat situations, or, being under assault or something like that. Yeah.
So kind of given that experience of maybe having experienced a trauma freeze response, how can we use breath to heal from that experience? Because I guess then there's a propensity to maybe freeze more in
and some people would use a phrase like parasympathetic shutdown, where you might not be totally freezing, but I think all of us, and I think, have like modes we go into easily, like if there's some sort of small social threat, being a bit frozen or being a bit anxious or being a bit feisty. But if that happens, the breath can be helpful, because being aware of the breath sort of brings you back into the body, helps you to take charge of it, moving into a controlled breath. So that might be, and if you want to lift your energy a bit, you focus more on the inhale. If you are conscious of breathing a bit higher in the chest, using the diaphragm but still filling up the top of the chest, tends to lift your energy a little bit, as opposed to if you're breathing lower in the chest, it tends to be calming in that sort of way. And what I really like is if people can, just to encourage people to play with their breath, that because if you move into that sort of feeling a bit shut down or a bit frozen, if you can just breathe fully and take a controlled breath in and out. And the more you do it, the more you're able to do it as a muscular sort of action. You get aware of the diaphragm, whether you want to extend the exhalation, squeezing the belly in. Like the inhalation, you don't squeeze the belly out, you just focus on the diaphragm, whether you use the rib muscles and the upper chest muscles. Because then you can use it under threat. And I know sometimes when I've been really, really anxious, if I'm aware of it, because I'm used to the breathing, you can do that. And then it sort of takes it over, it just cranks it down. I sometimes scale it, like if you're on a 9 out of 10 anxiety, it won't take it to 0, but it will take it down to a 6 or a 5. Makes it much easier to decide what to do. And if people are a bit frozen, then taking full breaths in, full breaths out, tends to, help to put you back in charge, to mobilize you again.
It gives us a bit of control in a situation that can be really difficult. And I'm sure a lot of us have had that experience of almost feeling a bit, well, maybe not all of us. I've certainly had the almost frozen experience in a social situation where no words come out, which doesn't help you feel any more relaxed, does it? It's part of being human. But here we have this beautiful tool then, if we're starting to take those deeper, fuller breaths, that might kind of help us. Or as you said, if we need a bit more energy, starting to do a little bit more of an inhale, focusing on the chest rising as well.
And there can be another one for energizing is breathing sort of, there's an Eastern one from in Tai Chi, they use in Qi Kung, breathing more to just below the belly, sort of pumping that a little bit as if the energy of the breath is going there. And the breath literally doesn't go there, sort of below and behind the belly, but breathing there tends to, the sort of thing people might do before they break bricks in karate, that tends to be energizing. And also simple things like if you breathe more up the back of the body, that's subtle, so it takes a while to get. That's calming, very good before meditation. If you're breathing more at the front of the body, it's more emotional. So often people want to calm themselves not do that. But if you're wanting to release emotion because you're feeling a bit sort of blocked or stuck, then that can be helpful. That's
a really interesting point. And it's interesting what you said about, before you break bricks in karate or something, that often it seems like in our Western society, we've been disconnected from our breath and from the utility that in other cultures and practices, this is a tool that people have been using, for many, many years. And sure, it comes up in our therapeutic work as psychologists. There's some breathing that we talk through, but you did, I think, an excellent job in your book of outlining all of the different strategies that we might be able to use for varying situations, that it can be much more specific, whether it's breaking a brick or a social situation, that there's different strategies depending on our nuances as an individual, as well as the situation we might be entering in and what we're hoping for.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it can work in a whole sort of range of ways. And I've done training mostly in yoga, but also in Qi Kung, the Chinese sort of energy systems. And they're very nice, I think, that at a subtler level, sort of away from the psychology, I guess, but of getting in touch with the energy, like they're very much in terms of the energy flows through the body and being aware of that, and the breath can link with that and connecting with the energy. Of the earth and the heavens. So that gets a little more out there for some people, but certainly practices I really enjoy doing.
And something that might bring us a sense of empowerment and connection. We know that, spirituality and a sense of connection in whatever model that we might feel connected to, but that a sense of a broader connection is so associated with our well-being and our health. Regardless of our culture. So if there's a way that we can bring in a sense of connection, a framework that works for us, that sounds like an additional benefit, this intentionality in the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And with so one of the Qigong Chinese ideas that I love is that the earth likes our negative energy. It recycles it like compost. So there's a lovely practice I'll often do, just putting bare feet on the earth and then imagine drawing the energy of the earth up through your feet. There's a point there that they call the bubbling springs, where the energy of the earth
gorgeous.
Goes up into your body and letting it come and fill your body, this beautiful earth energy, and then letting all the tension flow down into the earth and it recycles it. Or another way of releasing stress that I like, they say trees like it, like the trees recycle carbon dioxide to oxygen, and just all your stress, a forceful breath through first lips, it can be to just send all that energy out to a tree. I often send it out to our beautiful pomegranate tree.
And we are sitting in Greg's house right now with his pomegranate trees and all of his beautiful plants and trees around. What a beautiful practice.
And I might just add one more with the energy. What's fascinating, because energy hasn't had Western recognition, but it's been there in yoga and Qigong and many Eastern traditions. But they're beginning to measure it now. There's a center in America called the Heart Math Institute, like Heart Arithmetic, which I hadn't gotten onto before writing the book, but they find they can measure that now. They're measuring a sort of energetic field of the heart. And so some of the practices, there's a nice one again from the Chinese tradition that I'll do and teach people, just to imagine sending and receiving love to your heart. Imagine someone you love or something you love or something inspiring for you, like a beautiful landscape being in front of you, and taking in a sense of love or gratitude from that, and then sending that out again. And these heart math people do a very similar exercise and actually measure some of the heart energy, and it sort of builds in doing that the heart is not just a pump, but it also actually has like its own little brain in there, a nerve plexus. It's linked with endocrine sort of substances and energy. So some of the energy stuff's getting a bit of Western credibility now, as opposed to people doing it because it works and they can feel it from an Eastern perspective.
That's an interesting, that there's this experiential element, that if we try it and we kind of know it to be true in ourselves and our experience, we keep practicing. But that being creatures in this Western framework, we like to measure things, don't we? And use that scientific framework, which has benefits as well, but how interesting that they're measuring it and actually sensing like this energetic center of the heart. And what you describe is this breathing exercise, essentially this meditation of sending, receiving love, and that then pairs with perhaps like a loving kindness meditation,
very much.
For which we know that there's measurable benefit in terms of emotional well-being and empathetic capacity. So all of this is like coming together, isn't it? This is a really exciting time.
And it's funny because I like the practices and do them because they feel good, and I'm sure you do too, but in sort of writing about it, you feel like you have to try to justify it in these other sort of ways. And so loving kindness, then that feels good to do it, and people feel happier when they do it, imagining the loving kindness. And but they're also putting people in MRI machines as they do it and seeing different parts of their brain light up, and so it gives it a Western credibility.
Incredible the way we do things, isn't it? And how brilliant connecting with nature as well. We all would accept very broadly that plants, trees, thrive off carbon dioxide, as it turns out we do as well. But that if we send this negative energy to them in a nourishing way, it's a releasing from us and allowing us to emotionally let go. And a lot of us would have rituals perhaps when we finish a really difficult task or a difficult conversation, or finish at work before we get home, something to kind of shift our state. This sounds like a really beautiful practice in that we're letting something uncomfortable, unhelpful for us go, but in a really kind way, and drawing something back, as well as we know nature has a host of benefits for our well-being.
I think so. I really like it. And even I think it is literal, the energy, but that even as a metaphor, that just that sense of having a feeling of that connection and imagining that, I think, has a whole lot of nice flow and benefits.
You also you mentioned like breathing down low in some of these exercises to gain a sense of energy and power. And that then relates to something that I think we do hear a lot about in our society. We do hear the term soul or plexus or energy center as well in sort of our gut area. So I think that's an interesting metaphor as well that I, knowing some of the frameworks, don't think is unexpected, but how powerful in some ways.
No, it's very nice, I think. And and there are different energy systems that sort of the chakras, like in the yoga one, but in the Chinese one, they have it like the lower energy center, which is very much linked with vitality, sort of in below and behind the navel. Then the heart center linked with sort of love and compassion, and then in the brain, sort of higher consciousness. But being aware of that sort of vitality and loving sort of energies, that you can link that with the breath, what you imagine sort of breathing in, how are you using the breath with that But always with awareness. I mean, if people are really pumping their breath, they can maybe over-breathe a bit, and that's okay for a little bit.
Could you talk us through that? Maybe some of the risks or things we might need to be mindful of if we're starting a breathing practice.
Yeah, I think for most breathing, we've got to breathe anyway, so it's a pretty safe thing to do, but just being conscious of it and trying to pay attention to your body. I mean, if you have any physical conditions, then maybe just check it out with your doctor, if you're going to do any particular sort of patterns. I mean, really breathing, in the book, there are some Eastern techniques which are very, very strong, which I don't go into the book because I think, then you need to check with certain conditions. But just gentle, if you're breathing to the belly, like you might be cautious, if you're pregnant. You don't
Give away. I won't be doing them right now. Yeah.
Or if you had any particular issues in that part of your body, just do it gently with awareness.
Yeah.
And where people do some other breathing where they're really, I just encourage people just to do it with awareness. Like there are some of the Eastern techniques where there might be long breath holds, but I think never strain. I mean, all of these things should be done without strain. Yeah. So I think generally they're pretty safe if you're doing them with awareness, without straining, noticing how you're feeling. Yeah. Whereas if people hold the breath for a very long time, having a pause, holding the breath briefly, people often do that anyway. But if you're holding it for a really long time, then you want to be cautious with that. Holding the breath, can link with raising your blood pressure. So if you have high blood pressure and you're holding your breath a lot, maybe that's not the best thing for you. Yeah. So just,
sounds like the messaging is around
general sort of self-awareness and common sense.
And self-care by the sounds, being kind to ourselves, that if something isn't feeling right, we take a step back and check in and go slow, that we don't need to get to any place immediately, that we can go slow with developing our breathing skills as much as any other skill or practice in our lives. Where could we start? Could you talk us through, I know that, this is podcast format, so listeners aren't going to be able to see what you're doing, but maybe talk us through breathing exercise, and then listeners, head to Greg's website, because you do actually have a couple of videos up there where listeners can actually see some breathing demonstrations and have more visual guidance. So show notes, it'll be linked in the show notes, but we'll get Greg's details at the end. But for now, is there maybe a breathing exercise we could verbally talk through? Yeah,
sure. So I think if people just want to sit tall in the chair or wherever they're sitting, just not sort of slumping, it helps. And just being aware of the diaphragm initially is nice, so that if you put your hand just sort of across, just underneath the ribs, and then just trying to have that feeling, remember the diaphragm at rest is curved up a bit like a parachute, and the muscle fibers are long there, so as it contracts, they thicken and pull down. So just trying to breathe, being aware of the diaphragm. Some people will be aware already, but some won't. So as you're breathing in, just trying to get that feeling that the belly goes out a little bit, the lower ribs go out a little bit, just to be aware of the diaphragm. And then as you breathe out, just relaxing, you can feel it goes in and up. There's a natural elasticity, then just squeezing in the belly a little bit at the end, just to extend the exhale a bit. Then breathing in, focusing on the diaphragm again if you can. You're not pushing the belly out, it would just naturally go out a little as the diaphragm pulls down, thickens and flattens. And then breathing out, just allowing the breath out. So we're just mostly relaxing here. There's a natural elasticity as it relaxes, the diaphragm goes in and up, and just squeezing the belly in a little at the end. Breathing in and breathing out. And just seeing if you can feel that. The more you can be aware of the diaphragm, it really is really nice that it tends to be calming and centering. And we can do one more, just a little bit more elaborate. So again, sitting tall, what we're going to do in this is imagine breathing in a bit of a circle. So you're breathing up the back of the body, imagining as if you're breathing from the pelvis, from the very base of the spine, up the back of the body. Breathing up the back of the body has this calming effect. And of course, the breath, the air doesn't literally go down into your pelvis, but it draws the diaphragm down at the back, has a calming effect. Then letting the air come forward. I'm just describing it now, I'll talk you through it in a minute. So the chest sort of opens at the front. Opening the upper chest like that as you breathe tends to be energizing, very good for vitality, and then squeezing in down the front. At the end, squeezing in the belly, and then at the end of it, pulling the pelvic muscles in and up a bit. Now, it can seem like they're a long way from where your lungs are, but they're very common in Eastern practices, that it just sets up this flow of exhalation and is really nice for the energy in the body. So just all breathing out together. And then breathing in, imagine that you're breathing in up the back of the body. The breath is flowing up the back of the body, and then up the back of the ribs, and then coming forward. So the upper chest expands at the end of the inhale, and then breathing out, just relaxing to start with. The chest goes in a bit, then breathing out, squeezing in the belly, and particularly the lower belly muscles, and then squeezing the pelvic muscles in and up. Then breathing in, up the back of the body, finishing at the front of the chest, coming forward, and then breathing out, down the front, just relaxing to start. Then squeezing in the belly, just very gently, and pulling the pelvic muscles in and up a bit at the end of the exhale. Then breathing in again, up the back. The belly doesn't really release, it releases a little bit, you don't push it out at all. Breath going up the back of the body. You can feel the back ribs expand a little bit. Coming forward to the front of the chest, then breathing out down the front. At the end of the exhalation, squeezing in the belly, pulling in and up the pelvic muscles. Then breathing up the back again. And just in silence, just do a couple more rounds of that, just doing that as slowly as feels comfortable for you.
It's amazing to me how it brings in a visual element. But sorry.
No, that's fine. And just finishing with it, at the end of the next inhale, and then just letting go, just relaxing.
I jumped into
that's okay.
Give my unsolicited reflections.
Well, it's a bit hard to know how long to leave a pause in the podcast.
Or if you were driving, hopefully you didn't close your eyes like I did. But you can always come back to it.
Yes, don't do it while you're driving.
We can jump in.
Eyes
we can
open.
leave a memo before it. But I think that's really interesting because for me, I had this really interesting experience of like starting to notice and like look into my body, which cultivates this other awareness and connection, as well as, the effect that the breath is physiologically having. I feel like this is a real beautiful gateway to getting to know ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. I'd really agree with that. And I think the breath can be a really nice gateway into just that simple joy of being in your body. I think that ideally, and hopefully the breathing can lead to this, and some meditation leads to this, just that sense of being able to close your eyes and have that sense of inner peace, and just being there in touch with your body, and that body awareness hopefully can feel really peaceful and joyous. And I know clinically, working as a psychologist, like that's not always the case, that some people have other issues that they're dealing with, and different reactions can.
And maybe it's starting with eyes open a little bit as well.
They can keep their eyes open doing that. But also the idea that, as you practice it more, you get more in touch with your body, you get more comfortable with your body. If people have gone through bad trauma, sometimes their body reactions can be a bit frightening. And so, you go gently with this. I think the other things can happen occasionally if people have had some sort of trauma. When they relax, sometimes there can be a bit of a paradoxical, it's not very common, but it's sort of tensing up and feeling a bit unsafe. So just sort of, ease your way through that. If that happens, that won't happen for many people.
And I guess in that case, kind of given a significant history, it might be advisable to work with a professional generally, as well as in these exercises, so that you have that sense of support. And for a lot of us, it's going to be learning these techniques and grabbing a copy of Purposeful Breathing, and there, you describe in such rich detail all of the underlying philosophy, science behind these practices. And I was saying to Greg that I found it really easeful to read because he brings in the science, but he presents it in English, like in a really easeful language to read, which makes for easier reading. And also there's some wonderful pictures kind of displaying these breathing exercises and talking us through this practice, so we too might then be able to create this place of refuge, a breathing practice with intention that we can turn to regularly as a check-in second point, as well as using these strategies in difficult situations, and situations where we might need like an afternoon pick-me-up as a substitute if we can't get a coffee.
I think a pick-me-up is great. And I think the more you play with it, because, and for people who do get very anxious, which I use a lot with, like in the space of 1 or 2 breaths, once they're used to it, of taking diaphragmatically and extending the exhalation, slowing the breath down, like it goes from that 8 or 9 on a scale down to 5 or 6 and lower. And so you can use the breathing, all sorts of different breathing to try these different patterns, breathing more fully. It can be done very slowly, or you can breathe in a more muscular fashion to pump yourself up a bit as well. There are different ways to energize. So it's a really nice thing to be able to use, like as a break from work, just sitting at the desk. People don't smoke much anymore, which is good, but sometimes when I have people who do, I say instead of having a smoko, go and have a breatho, that you can go and just do some breathing, just go out and get away from the desk and do a couple of minutes, just doing some controlled breathing to energize or to calm or to focus. Or as a snack, instead of having a biscuit, like you can do some of these different breaths to lift yourself a bit or to energize. So it's really nice, I think, and the more you play with it, the more you're familiar with it, the more it becomes available to you if you do want it in stressful situations, and the more it can be a practice. Like I do a practice every day of at least half an hour, which I'll begin with controlled breathing and then move into meditation. And the breathing in itself is a form of meditation, just being aware of the breath. So, you can do it for half a minute, or you can do it for half an hour, or you can do it for longer.
Yeah. So depending on your needs, your unique situation, maybe this can be our little action in addition to coming back and checking out these breathing exercises when you are perhaps able to sit down and engage in them. But to actually reflect on what your schedule's like, your day and your needs, and how you might incorporate some of these breathing exercises in as snacks, as breaks, as meditation, whatever it might be for each of you. So Greg, how can listeners connect with you, contact you? What's the best way?
If they want to contact me, they're very welcome to. I have a small website called mindbodymodes.com, so written as one word, Mind Body Modes. I have an email, Greg Smith Psychology, written as one word, at gmail.com. So I'm very happy for people to send me an email if they'd like to.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. And I will put the links in the show notes. So listeners, you can always head there to grab them as well. But definitely, if you're a visual person, check out the videos on Greg's website and grab a copy of Purposeful Breathing, of course. So thank you so much for your time today, Greg.
Thank you for having me, Caitlin. That was great. Thank you.
Absolute delight. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I think Greg's capacity to bridge the East and the West is quite incredible. And I also hope that you enjoyed that breathing practice. You'll be able to find the breathing practice itself just as a little download on my website, drcaitlin.com, and then just click through to Greg's interview. If, of course, you have any questions or comments, please reach out. You can find us on Instagram at Dr. Caitlin, or on Facebook at Wisdom for Wellbeing Pod, or at Dr. Caitlin. All right, I will look forward to connecting in your earbuds next fortnight. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast. Please visit drcaitlin.com to connect, find show notes, other episodes, and to subscribe. While you're at it, if you find value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating, or perhaps simply tell a friend about the show. Wisdom for Wellbeing is not a substitute for professional, individualized mental health treatment. If you are in crisis, please contact 000, your local emergency number if you are outside of Australia, or attend your local hospital ED.